Okie dokie. Putting in my nice silent logo. Clickety clack, clickety clack. Whir. Welcome to Evolution Hour. There's my tortucanwordpress.com and clickety clack times. And Pete's wonderful logo that he came up with for Troubles in Paradise, my methodology of creationism work. A little bit of atomic thingies in there just to show all that off. Everybody know about my WordPress website. If you haven't put that on your smartphone or your PC and your go-to places, why not? That's what it's there for. I've got a ton of stuff there and links to all my books and links to everything and blah, 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 and so forth and so on. That's the shameless plug. So I will stop sharing that little puppy, and we will deal with the new issue, which is the continuing saga of the creationist book, Contested Bones. Let me get my little camera knocked around here so I can see what the hell I'm doing. I'm dealing with the Contested Bones book by creationists Christopher Rupe and John Sanford that was gifted to me kindly as an impoverished scholar. He is saying he didn't want to read it, but would he get it to me? I would be happy to. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And what I am doing is a full press source analysis. Oh, I see Animal in the room. I'll say hi to you. Hi, Animal. Source analysis is at the basic core of what I've been doing in my TIP project, which is, yeah, you know the science, but what of the science does your opponents pay attention to? What sources do they use? How do they deal with them? This is telling you about how everybody thinks. It's a universal toolkit. And I've done 2 episodes on this so far. What I've done, I've got Cap in the room. He's one of the people that's been following the stuff, and I'll give you a shout out in just a moment. But I'm first going to be putting up my little blurb here, another little screensaver thing to show, or screen share to show what's going on. As usual, I have to hunt around for my buttons in here. There we go. Oh, yeah. You can now see the spreadsheet that I'm continuing to work on. I'm about in, I've just hit, because I've got a bunch of other things in my life going on, I'm about at page 40 of the work. And so far, they've generated 55 citations. And I've been breaking them down by the technical papers. These are the primary source science works. Then there's secondary coverage. These are general books, newspaper articles, science articles. They may appear in a science journal, but if they're a commentary piece, they're not in the same ballpark. General work, so far he hasn't cited any of those. One creationist work, Marvin Lubenow, and that was just for an authority quote. And then I have a column here breaking things down by whether or not they're just being cited for authority quotes. And as you can see, there's a lot of that orange authority quoting going on, that in fact 64% of the sources that they've cited so far are just for authority quotes, and 65% of their work is just secondary citations so far. Only about a third is technical. They've only cited 18 papers out of the page 39 that I've got to, which is a little over or less than 1 technical per page. So the blue, what does the blue refer to? Ah, that's where they're making science mistakes. That's where they're citing technical papers, and the papers do not say what they claim they do. And I'd already done a couple shows on that, which means 1/3 of their technical data are making false, or rather they're misusing the source. The ones that have whites are just ones where they're making generic assertions. They're not making anything pro or con, conflicting it. It's the equivalent of saying the sun rises in the east. And then the ones that are in the orange again, or sand, are the ones that are being used for authority quotes, and about a third of their stuff is being used for that. So what I'm going to be discussing today is some more of that delightful misuse of technical citation stuff that we were dealing with in the previous ones. Now I'll stop and actually introduce Cap, who's here as my foil today. Hi, Cap.
Hi. Yeah, wait, so RJ, I just have to ask this. I mean, it raises a question when you mentioned the blue where they're misrepresenting the source. Are you saying that creationists aren't entirely honest? I mean,
oh my,
the
I am
audacity
so
of
shocked
that.
to hear that. Yeah, and in fact, that's the whole point, is that what I'm going to be hoping, there's that column that I have for the creationists, the pink column. That's something where they're actually making claims, drawing on a creationist source, or where they are using the science data to buttress their claim, if they can get around to figuring out what it is. And so far, there hasn't been any science data that supports all of that. Anyway, what I came up with for today's show relates to those wacky Neanderthals. We now know that the Neanderthal population would split off at least some 600,000 years from our common ancestors, and about 300,000 years after that, the Neanderthals were still knocking around pretty much and doing nicely. And along comes our human species down in Africa. Where exactly in Africa is now deliciously more complicated, because we find out they're not all living in South Africa. There's some up in the Sahara region and that date back that far. And eventually they start bumping into the Neanderthals, particularly in what is now the Middle East, and some boinkings going on occasionally, maybe 100 or more, but not all that many interbreeding episodes, and that produces the degree of DNA our genome, 2 to 4%-ish for people that live in Eurasia. Virtually nobody in Africa. I think a few pop up in Melanesia and a couple other places. Because I got white skin, I'm assuming if I did a DNA analysis of me, there's probably a good chance that there's some DNA from Neanderthals in me, and probably in you as well.
Yeah.
And I would hope so. I hope I'm as much of a mongrel as possible, because it's good for the genetics. Anyway, there was a roller coaster period going on back for about the last 50 years that I've been kind of following in my research. And one person said a future topic for Evolution Hour should be the evolution of creationism. Well, I can bring a little bit of that up here, because they've been riffing off of this. And that is, are Neanderthals our species or not? Are they a separate species or not? And the tendency was to regard them as a separate species, except in the 70s, there were a lot of what would be called lumpers, who were thinking maybe they were just a subspecies of us. So for a while, there was an effort to try to call them Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which would be the subspecies of our species. But it was increasingly the case that when you looked at the increasing number of Neanderthal fossils that were being found, that it was hard to defend that. Their skulls are so different. Their postcranial anatomy is pretty similar, although more robust because they're living in a colder climate. So the lung structures are a bit different, and virtually all the same bones are involved. But the growth rates and structure of things didn't quite match up with anything that was in the human range completely. And so that attempt to treat them as a separate subspecies really has kind of fizzled out before the coup de grace, which was the DNA. When they actually started finding complete DNA genomes, yes, there was interbreeding. They were close enough to us, they could do that on occasion, but they're still sufficiently far away that they're really, no, they're Homo neanderthalensis, not Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. And then the other element is, as they find more and more examples, they've got juvenile Neanderthals, they can see growth patterns in the way tooth eruption patterns and things are occurring, and it's just outside the human range. They're not the same species. So that's the state of the art in 2017 when this creationist book is coming out. And how much do they deal with it? Well, they don't want Neanderthals to be anything other than oddly varied human beings. So on one of the pages, they get a cute little, I gotta pull this back far enough. There's a picture of a Russian wrestler that they put up. And this supposedly is sort of Neanderthal-y features. Well, you'll notice something really, yeah, he's got kind of brow ridges and the forehead slopes back, but that's actually not a Neanderthal feature, is a back-sloping forehead. That's just the range that primates do generally, not just humans, not just anybody else. They don't really have the rest of the skull shape, but something that stands out like a sore thumb, or in this case, a big chin, is he has a chin. And Neanderthals have no chin at all.
Yeah.
And that's part of the difficulties with trying to lump human beings together with Neanderthals involves that. So on this very page, he makes, jump in. Yeah, make a point.
Oh, I was just going to make a really bad joke. I was kind of thinking more out loud. I was like,
that's what we
so
expect
you're telling
for,
me that the Neanderthals can't take it on the chin?
Yeah, they can't take it on the chin. Yeah, and it's eventually they'll probably be poking around as to what exact genes difference as to why the Neanderthals have no chin and whether or not it's adaptive or just a particular spandrel. Animal is saying that if this book is trying to say that scientists think that Neanderthals are our ancestors, we don't. It's just another species of the genus Homo. Exactly. And that we share common ancestors, that no human being is coming from the branch of Neanderthals. And in fact, it hasn't been regarded as likely that that would be the case for a really long time. That wasn't even the case when I was reading stuff in the 70s and 80s when I was just starting to get into the science world. But anyway, on this little page, right above the picture of the Neanderthalish Russian wrestler, a boxing champion, Our authors say the human individuals living today display classic Neanderthal features. Footnote 30. That would be the Eric Trinkhaus article that I put a link up to in the description to this video, so everybody can go look. They can download the whole bloody paper and read it, because the paper does not claim human individuals living today display classic Neanderthal features. If you can find someplace in that article that I managed to miss where they make such a statement, or where the authors somehow could have thought they did, let me know, please. I mean this seriously, because as far as I can see, they're claiming no such thing. They are noting in archaic humans and archaic Europeans that there are some of these fossils that were showing up in this article, which dated from 2003, so it's quite a ways back. It's just before they were starting to discover the Denisovans and all that, that were showing a mixture of typical human and typical Neanderthal features in mosaics. And this was the first salvo in the recognition. O'Brien says, "Afternoon, Professor. I wish I were a professor, but I'm just a person with a BA in history. But I pretend to be one on YouTube." So there we go. Okay. Anyway, they began to realize that there was much more human diversity going on in the subspecies and speciation splitting off process that were producing Neanderthals, and then this mysterious Denisovan group that we now know about, that also showing a gene flow back and forth. And that eventually leads to the idea that's current, that some want to kind of broaden the definition of what human means. That in that sense, if you regard the human species as part of that big block of gene flow that's happening about 700,000 years ago or more, and that our particular branch is just the most specialized group of survivors since everybody else has gone extinct, then in that sense, Neanderthals and humans and Denisovans are all part of the Homo sapien group. And there's a group of paleoanthropologists that use it in that term, but it doesn't mean what the creationists want it to mean, which is Neanderthals are just oddly variant human beings. So I suggest to everybody they can read the Trinkhaus article, and that's a real live science paper. It's also, from a methods point of view, a useful measuring stick that you can use. If you can read through that paper and it sounds like Martian to you, then you need to research more to understand the terminology. And if you want to be serious in grappling with any anti-evolutionists on these matters of human evolution, and they don't like human evolution, so you would need to eventually bump into data field like that, that's a good test bed. Now you can use another paper that I put up, which was on the very next page. Oh, did you want to jump in and say something?
I just, something Sewer Tape said, I had to kind of chuckle. I didn't know if you saw it. It said, RJ is too badass to be a professor. He's more like a science vigilante.
I just saw that too. Yeah, RJ, the science vigilante. Yeah, because I'm beholden to nobody. Boy, am I beholden to nobody except the people that voluntarily help the project and buy my books and listen to the videos and all that. I don't have a grant. I don't have a tenure that I have to defend or not. I don't have any people that are institutionally supporting me that I have to kowtow or kiss ass. So I have a vigilante quality about me. I can speak my mind, and people who've been following me can kind of see that I do that. I don't cut anybody any slack. Oh, Animal's got to go. See you later, Animal. You can catch the rest of the video later.
See you, Animal.
Anyway, what I was about to get to on this thing is on the very next page, our authors decide to drag in the notion that Neanderthals are really kind of like normal people. And so I will read a little passage here. Thomas Huxley was the first to compare Australian Aboriginal skulls to Neanderthals in 1863. He noted the skulls displayed a number of morphological similarities to Neanderthals. Note 35. Well, that is the Curnoe paper from 2011. And I put a link up to that because it's freebie, so everybody can take a look at it. It's really a good survey. It's written for a less technical audience, but it's still a technical paper. And you can compare that to the Trinkhaus paper in PNAS, that you can see the difference between a survey technical article and a technical article. That for the times of terminologies used, the extent to which they explain details and background history in a way that isn't showing up in the Trinkhaus because it's aimed for a technical audience. So those are all kind of useful ones. Now, the fun part is tracking down, again, what they mean by stuff. First of all, as a matter of history, it was painfully obvious from the Curnoe article that when Huxley was writing in 1863, they had almost no data. They had very few Neanderthal skulls. They had nothing else other than that in 1863. They didn't know about what we now call Homo erectus. They didn't have any of the Australopithecines. They didn't have a lot of range to tell what the hell was going on. All they had was a bunch of ethnographers running around trying to capture skulls of people. Even that, the pseudoscience racist types in the 1890s had a bigger data field to play off of than Huxley had in 1863. So what they were doing is looking at skulls that were coming in, and you would see probably a little more pronounced brow ridge, and that would seem to be sort of Neanderthoid, but they still got chin. And so the next article, there's this Burkhead and Hunter article from 1922. I didn't put it in a link, but it's available open access, Journal of Anatomy stuff. You can find them online. And it turned out to have actually been referenced for this skull of an Australian Aborigine that was in the Curnoe article. So I strongly suspect that our little parasite Rupe got the Burkett article because he saw it in the Curnoe article. And I can just see the daisy chain, but there's a picture of the skull that was being alluded to in there, and you can look up the original paper and you can find out that that's all you get in that from 1922. Yeah. There's no side view or the front view. You don't have the kind of forensic details that would be common 50 or 60 years later. 1922, they were just getting the field of it. It wasn't even entirely clear whether it was an adult skull or not. And so the provenance of it, the dating of it, we would have no notion whatsoever, because we now know that humans are bumping in. Mungo Man, if memory serves me, dates from at least 40,000, and I think the dates sometimes even run to 60,000 years old. So it's within the range of when human beings had occurred by that time. But just what branch and how much admixture of Neanderthal and other was popping up in the Aboriginal population, that I'm not entirely sure whether they've clarified all the little data on that, whether or not there's much, how much of that pops up. I can't remember. It may be that there's no Neanderthal DNA showing up in the Australians, Aborigines or not. Somebody will have to check on that, and if you know some information on that, put a little field up on it. But anyway, what it means is that as I've been plowing through the source material, when they get to some controversial claims where they're really trying to buttress their weird view of Neanderthals and their weird view of anti-evolution for the creationist cause, they do badly on the source citations. And it's Rupe who's the guy who's at fault here, not Sanford, because Sanford in his introduction pointedly admits that the guy who did the homework was Mr. Rupe. He did almost all of it. So we can presume that the scholarship that we're getting on this stuff is mainly Rupe's fault, this biologist of uncertain provenance who apparently doesn't teach anywhere, and Sanford is relying on as his authority figure, even though none of them know what they're talking about.
Yeah. I was going to say, is it wrong that I am not surprised that, they're referencing Huxley, who was, it really isn't, I mean, yeah, he had some points that are still somewhat valid, but I don't know many people who reference him as a source citation as something like that, because it's
just
like
the historical bit. He was certainly one of the founders of the popularity of evolution, but he wasn't. In some respects, he was more of a popularizer.
Yeah.
He did spot pretty early on the suspicion that this Archaeopteryx and bird evolution had something to do with dinosaurs, but that kind of got shunted aside. He had a few issues that were complicated. He gets into the debate because he coined the term agnostic, so he was a non-religionist, and that put him in that thing. He was also Darwin's bulldog. He was a sharp wit. He was a working class schlub like me, who had to scavenge around for jobs and lecture tours and stuff. He hated having to do that, but he needed to feed the family.
Yeah,
he became kind of a non-believer because he lost a child to terrible disease, the same way that Darwin had, and so that had an effect on him. There was a bit more of a petite racism to Huxley. Huxley had more disparaging things to say about black people than Darwin ever did. And so that's not one of the prettier signs of his personality. But overall, he was a very diligent and a clever guy who I admire an awful lot. A lot of his books are still available, and I think Project Gutenberg has some of them that you can still acquire. I'd looked through some of them years ago because the local colleges have copies of his stuff. He would be kind of like the Richard Dawkins of his era, I think would be a good analogy of where he placed on things. He also was an enormous popularizer of science education. The reason why colleges started having departments of science where they had degrees that were being given out in paleontology, not natural theology, is because of Huxley. So the modern collegiate landscape of where science becomes professionalized has to do a lot to Huxley's proselytizing for a secular science operation in colleges, rather than Darwin, who was basically just off on the farm studying worms.
Yeah, and I mean, I heard someone describe Huxley as this: he was really the first ever science communicator.
Yeah, and he was a diligent and sharp-witted fellow. He would also act on the defense front. I pointed out that one of the reasons why you can suspect that Louis Pasteur was not an anti-evolutionist is because if there were even the slightest hint in any of the scuttlebutt that this guy had a problem with evolution, Huxley and Wallace and others would have been on him like white to rice. They would have been immediately noticing that. Sewer Tape says, doesn't that 2% of Neanderthals still express in the form of recessive traits? I've heard red hair as an example. I think that's possible on the red hair. I can't be certain of it offhand. There are several technical papers that have been coming out just literally in the last year or so on which genes are involved in stuff. And some of them relate to our immune system. Some of them are things that make us more open to certain diseases, and some of us are protecting us against stuff. So there's a complex landscape of how that and why that little 2 to 4% or so is percolating along in the human genome, and why some of it's sustained and why some of it's hitchhikers and staying in play because it doesn't necessarily do anything bad or not. So keep an eye out for the technical literature over the next 5 years as they work out more and more details of this, and if they find even more of the DNA, because as they start pouring through the Denisovans more and more and looking at more and more of the alleles available in the DNA genomes that they've got, they're going to be studying more and more stuff. And it'll probably be co-authored in part by Svante Pääbo, the guy with all the umlauts in his name. I always have to type out carefully because he's got so many umlauts. He's one of the major figures there, that their teams in the various Uppsala, I think, up in Finland, they do a lot of genetic work with a lot of people involved in there. So you'll often find him as the co-author in these ones that have got huge pile up of 50, 60 scientists that are involved in there. That always takes me a while because I keep track for my tip project of all the people who have actually written the technical papers. Even though I may cite it as an et al., every single one of their names is put into my database. So I can tell you that the 23,000 technical papers in my field are written by upwards of 60,000 scientists. And therefore we can tell who isn't on it. And therefore we can tell how many anti-evolutionists aren't ones doing the work because they're not showing up in the technical literature. I'll just was checking some of my little side things that pop up in the menus from stuff. Another thing that I'll be dealing with in future will be Jonathan Sarfati, the same person that sent me this book, got me an e-book copy of Sarfati's book, The Greatest Hoax Ever. It's a riff off of the greatest show on earth, Dawkins' book. And Sarfati, when I finally got it, I go, yawn. I looked up the transitional fossil section. It's the same shtick he's been tossing out for the last 15 years. No reptile-mammal transition discussion, all authority quotes. Move on, Jonathan, move on. Old Scratch says, a new study finds that Archaeopteryx could only fly in short bursts like pheasants. This doesn't surprise me at all. That, first of all, Archaeopteryx lacks a sternum, the big developed furcula bone in the bird stomach that acts as flight muscle attachments and is the reason why more advanced birds are able to take off right from the ground. Archaeopteryx couldn't do that. And I loved Henry Gee's comment. This goes way back, and it's just as accurate today. He was saying that Archaeopteryx could fly better than a sack of potatoes, but that's about it.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah. Yeah. So sounds about right. I mean, from what I had read on Archaeopteryx a little bit, I have touched, is that it was just more. They could fly a little bit in like little short bursts for like maybe about 20-some feet, but not too far.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember exactly how far, but
your potential competitors don't fly at all,
Yeah, that
that's a
20 feet.
gigantic advantage.
Yeah, it would be like they would run and kind of flap their wings, and they would get enough with a little burst where they would be able to fly 20 feet ahead, and
Or
then they
because
could get away. But
they had
mostly
grasping
from
helixes so they could climb.
yeah,
One suspects that a lot of Archaeopteryx and other flyers, Microraptor the same way,
yeah,
are flying down from trees. And all
yeah,
they need to have
no,
is the maneuverability aspect. The Alleluia feather, I mispronounced that. It's a guidance feather that you find on the wingtips of birds. That
yeah,
doesn't show up for a long time. You don't start seeing that on birds
yeah,
until the Cretaceous, tens of millions of years later. By that time, you're
yeah,
starting to see more and more sophisticated birds. You're seeing the development of the sternum, so the flight muscles are developing that increase their ability to fly. You've got the tail shortening because they don't need that anymore, and they're eliminating their teeth. Apparently, the diet and dynamics of birds mean that whatever,
yeah,
since toothlessness shows up a lot in dinosaurs generally, that I suspect the same genetic mechanisms and the same selection pressure convergences are applying in the bird case. And the point is that all birds got on that, probably because all the birds that we have today are descended from the ones that made it through the KT extinction, because the dominant birds of the dinosaur era weren't the ornithischians that lead off to our group, the ones that we know. It's the enantornithines, these ones with the shoulder blades constructed in the reverse as to which one was attached to which. And we still don't know the details of how that originated, when, how far back in the bird lineage the enantornithines went, but they were the main kids on the block through all the Cretaceous period. And the ornithines had come along, but they were niche players, and they made it through the big mass extinction. And so by filter, everything since then are descended from that group, and all the non-ornithine birds went extinct.
yeah. And from what I understood with Archaeopteryx 2 was that it mostly glided. That was its main, and what
Well,
little
it
bit of
could
wing
do
flapping.
flapping. The arm motion that allows it to flap occurs
Yeah,
as part of the dinosaur anatomy. The arms, all the motions
yeah,
that you need for flapping. It's that ability to take off from the ground that
yeah,
requires a much stronger muscle attachment system and the
yeah,
ability to generate a flap from things other than the glider aspect. And that's
yeah.
probably another reason why pterosaurs weren't able to keep up
And
with the birds, because I don't know that they were good at taking off from the ground either. Somebody who's a
yeah,
pterosaur expert wants to dump in, because you got a small rhamphorhynchids that went pretty much extinct in the face of bird pressure, that they couldn't compete. And the only ones that were managing in the Cretaceous were those monstrous gliders. The bigger pterosaurs, Quetzalcoatlus being one of the biggest, that's practically the size of a Cessna.
yeah,
And there's no bird that has that. Even today, even condors don't get as big as the pterosaurs. And so it's fun. They're still thrashing around the dynamics of the
yeah,
pterosaur structure and differing relationships between
yeah,
how birds conduct things. And then the other player on the field are bats. And
yeah,
it's revealing that although birds have a high thermostat, there is no bat that gets quite as big as the biggest birds. And so they've got a different dynamic that need to sustain that furball metabolism. Probably put some upper boundary layers on the ability of bats to do things. You can get pretty big, but nowhere big as a condor. And when, if you're flightless, there's no counterpart to giant killer ground hugging bats. Bats
yeah,
have gotten dedicated flyers, and so as soon as they land on the ground, they clamber around rather clumsily. They're not very adept on the ground because they got those damn wings to take care of. And pterosaurs probably had some of the same limitations. Whereas birds, when they land on the ground, they're still bipeds and they're very agile. And indeed, the killer birds that were the giant predators in South America after the mass extinction, they were just doing great gangbusters. And they went along very effectively as the major predators in the South American
yeah,
environment until the Isthmus of Panama formed and all those cats came in, those leopards, and
yeah,
suddenly started competing with them, and whoop, they went extinct.
yeah. And what I was gonna say on Archaeopteryx too with the flapping was what I had read that most early soul that I have read, and I could be wrong in this. Maybe there's something out there that I missed. I don't read a whole lot of technical literature, but from what I had found, was that what they knew the Archaeopteryx could flap, but what that was used more was for after the guide to kind of just give them a little bit of propulsion and maneuverability from
Yeah,
what it was used
maneuverability
for.
was everything. That's one of the reasons
Yeah,
why birds were able to be so adaptable, because and even the Wright brothers, when they came up with airplanes, had to realize that it's not merely lift that's important, it's control.
yeah,
And if you can't maneuver effectively, you're slamming into crap. And you've got to be able to land efficiently without rolling up into a ball. And fortunately, I suspect that the birds had some pre-adaptation from the fact that they were already really agile as bipeds.
yeah,
So an awful lot of the things that there's very logical to imagine that an awful lot of dinosaurs were capable of leaping, particularly predatory deinonychids. It's highly likely from the information that's on how they would have attacked a sauropod, would be leaping up onto the side of it and ripping it with their sickle claws. And so that ability to handle themselves, to jump up onto things
yeah,
effectively, to climb. Several dinosaurs were, some of the smaller ones were perfectly capable of climbing. And so you've got to be able to move agilely. You've got to have a good sense of balance, recovery from
yeah,
bumping into things. And birds already had that as a pre-adaptation. They didn't have to invent it
yeah,
whole cloth.
yeah. And that was, like I said, what I had read mostly what was used for was they could flap, but it wasn't for flying per se. It was more used for steering
Yeah,
and if they and get a little
I'm not
propulsion
sure
out of
either
it.
on whether or not that sounds very plausible in that as well. And they've done a
Yeah,
lot of dynamic studies on things, and it's
yeah,
showing the enormous variety that's going on. They had to think through the same thing in relation to Microraptor, because it's got hind-leg feathers, which is unlike any existing
yeah,
form. And
yeah.
it's an Archaeopteryx isn't on. It's not regarded as being close to the group that actually produced the ornithines. So technically speaking, no bird is descended from Archaeopteryx, and that disproves evolution according to the creationist.
Yeah,
Give me a break.
yeah.
No cousins. Oh, a sewer points out,
Oh,
sewer tape, some hawks still stalk prey on foot through dense foliage. Truly awesome to watch. Yeah, there's the
I'll have to look that up.
agility. Somebody put up, I can't remember who put up the picture just a week or so ago of a human hand next to an eagle claw, a talon, and you realize how big those feet are. Wow.
Oh yeah,
And those sharp
yeah.
little things, they're good at that.
I've seen an actual eagle claw before because the local zoo where I live, one about 20 miles away from me, came up to our school and did a presentation. They had an actual claw of an eagle that they used to have, and then it died, and they kept the claw for like presentation purposes. And that thing is like, I mean, I was like in fifth grade, and I was like, yeah, I
It's
don't want to
big.
run into
Mhm.
that.
You
I'm
don't
glad
want
I
to
don't
have
run
any
into
little
that.
bump ins. I'm putting
Oh
on
yeah,
my screen share here again to put up my RJ's Patreon. We're about halfway through the show here. And there's Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Totus Real and Everett and Paul. Thank all of you for supporting the project with actual moolah. I've put up again, behold and partake of hashtag tip at www.tortucan.wordpress.com. Please put it on your tabs and make use of the material, and stop in and say hi in the comment sections. Show you're watching it. Let everybody know about it, because the work that I put together can't do diddly if you're not making use of it and reading the material and studying all the stuff that I've tried to put together and am continuing to put together in my work. The Patreon, I still have the Patreon up because it is still functional, but I must say it is as slow as molasses thing on them getting money to me, unless you've got zillion followers and that. So it's not the happiest place on earth, but it's still active. So for those who want to donate much faster than that, please, the GoFundMe.com DC Go, that one, it gets to me literally in days, and it doesn't matter if you even $5, more than adequate.
yeah,
We'd like to see more of the crowd, but although it's really hard for herding cats among secularists
yeah.
and us crowd, but we're there. There's tons of you out there,
Yeah,
and it would really be nice to see more people helping,
yeah,
because I'm not made of money.
yeah.
This is
From what
still
old,
technically a peculiar hobby.
yeah, and I was going to point out what Old Scratch said about saw a video where baby birds flapping to climb up steep inclines. From what I had read, that's kind of similar to what I had read Archaeopteryx did to climb things was it was more just when they flat, it was to kind of try and get higher to get to a higher point so they could
Yeah.
then glide.
Yeah, as well. And I don't know whether I cited it in Evolution Slam Dunk or not, but it certainly is a thing that's in my stack of material to deal with bird evolution. But yeah, I think it's been a ways ago. It may even have been in the 1990s or early 21st century. But what they were testing out was the debate, which is to some extent passé, as to whether or not birds developed as the runner from the ground up or climbing up trees and flying arboreally model. And it's now regarded both are playing a role. But the point is that a bird that has a chick that has fairly ill-developed feathers, the very presence of those slowly developing feathers are able to improve its ability to run up inclines and to maneuver, even without leaving the ground. So there's a pre-adaptation element to once you have feathers going on in organisms, and if you have them developing for reasons other than flight, that there's an adaptive selection pressure for them independent of the flight element. Then later on, if you have the flight element develop because they've got now sufficient amount of feathering that they can now leap off of an incline or off of a rock, or even to the extent if they run fast enough, they may actually get into the air. And if you're evading a predator, boy, that's handy if you fly even a bit and they don't.
Yeah.
In the same way that the ability to go into the water or not. One of the reasons why it's highly unlikely that if you're a sauropod being chased by a carnosaur, the last place you want to run is into the water. Because although you can swim, so can your predator.
Yeah.
And so it can actually probably swim way faster than you because you have more bulk. And it's just going to follow you along and get as soon as you start coming out of the water, it's going to do there as well. So the dynamics, it's fascinating to watch the detective story when you read the technical papers about how they work through so many different threads of evidence to build up the pictures of things and to figure out what was going on with ancient life.
Yeah. But RJ, I got to ask this. How do you know this? Were you there?
Were you there? Yeah, well, fortunately, we don't have to be there. I'll borrow a quote from my favorite transcendentalist, good old Henry David Thoreau, when he wrote that some circumstantial evidence is conclusive, like finding a trout in the milk. That there are some things we see this all the time. Anybody who watches a CSI style program is watching forensic science at work, and of course they fictionalize a lot of it. They've got these little computer simulations where they can expand the picture of the license plate in a way that you can't really do in reality, and blah blah blah, all that stuff. But the point is that ever since the Sherlock Holmes era, there's a whole forensic toolkit that develops to where clues mean things. You can tell from the way the blood spatters are in the room where the crime was taking place, whether or not it was from a left-handed or a right-handed person, how tall they were, and where they were standing. All of that can be inferred from the blood spatters on the wall. And it's as rigorous as if you drop a hammer on your down and your foot is in the way, expect an ow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That the odds of any wind gust coming along and deflecting the hammer before your foot gets hit is remote unless you're in the middle of a hurricane.
Yeah. Yeah. And even then that wind might not even be enough to push that hammer out of the way.
Exactly. And you could calculate all of that. Oh, Brian G says, I'm still reading through your book and gives it a thumbs up. I'm taking that to suggest that you're enjoying it. That would be Evolution Slam Dunk.
I'm kind of... Yeah, I've used it a few times in a couple arguments I've had. Like, I'm like, I remember, I was like, okay, I remember seeing something like this, and I would flip through the index and there it is. Oh, okay. Oh, and here's this paper, and then I would go find the paper online, and
and it says what I say it does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've actually gotten to the point where I'm just almost using whatever you cite. It's like I know it's going to say what he says. He's been accurate 100% of the time, and I have no reason to doubt.
But by all means, make a point of checking. I welcome it completely. That I knew I was fairly confident on the subject matter when Christine Janis loved the book. She's a mammal paleontologist. She knows the stuff. She could, and she is notorious for being finicky. And if she thinks you're making a bad argument, it doesn't matter how high you are up on the food chain, she's going to tell you. So the fact that she was delighted with it and found no errors at all in it means I think I've done my homework pretty damn well.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, yeah. So she's one of the people who she don't care who you are. To quote, how did a friend of mine he's a Marine, he says, yeah, the unspoken Marines general order is walk the post flank to flank and take crap off and don't take crap off any rank. So
yeah,
except he doesn't quite word it that way.
The most severe scientists, some of them are prickly and have odd reputations in others, but the vast majority of really serious scientists will dig in their heels on matters of fact, and they won't mind pointing out to you where you've gotten something wrong because they're dedicated to everybody getting it right.
Yeah.
And I'm in the same boat. I'm not infallible. I'm perfectly capable of making a goof up on things, but I try to learn from my goofs. So when I made some mistakes on things and I make revisions on stuff, in fact, I knew eventually somebody was going to spot the goof where I'm in the thing I have on the non-overlapping magisteria. I mentioned William Clifford, and I mistakenly referred to him as an American. And after I'd written it, I listened to him. The context in which I'd first heard about him made me think he was from the United States. And later on, I found out, oops, nope, he's British. And I did not correct the text. I didn't alter it. I kept it exactly as I wrote it and was just waiting to see how long it took before somebody spotted and called me on it. And finally, just this last couple months ago, somebody says, oh, you have a problem here. He's not an American. And I'm going, good of you to notice. So I decided actually I would leave what occasional blips that are in there. I will never correct them in the old text. If I correct them in any new text, I'll call attention to the fact that I made a mistake and that this is a revision, because that's what I did when I did the human evolution thing, Planet of the Apes thing. One mistake I'd made had to do with the tooth eruption pattern of Australopithecines. And I had 3 sources for it, but they were all secondary sources. And because I didn't have access in that time to the technical papers in a way that I do now, that's my mea culpa. I had no idea that they were behind the curve. My secondary sources weren't up on the technical literature. And I had a paleoanthropologist at the University of Toronto that vetted the paper for me, because I made sure I contacted people so that they would go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And the one mistake that I'd made in there was that, and she explained it to me and alluded to some technical papers that allowed me to correct it. And I explained the point of the mistake I made when I did the revision, and the version that you can see online explains all that, because that way you learn from it. You realize why you always want to put little flag marks next to your source material. New material, you always want to put a little flag mark. It's new. It doesn't mean it's going to stand. Maybe they're going to have some people that are going to hit it with a ton of bricks. Maybe they got part of the story right, but not all of it. So you wait and find out. If a source is really old, if somebody has cited a paper that's decades old, you have to go, why aren't they citing something newer? Is it that nobody's done it work? Were they unable to confirm it? So all of those are little flags you put up. It doesn't mean the work is instantly invalid, but you can also, another measure is whether or not it's highly cited or not. If a work is an older work, but it's seminal, and everyone has been using and relying on it, and there's been subsequent work building on it, that's a different kettle of fish than a 20-year-old paper, and you find out nobody has cited this. Uh-oh.
Yeah,
that's a warning flag.
Yeah, that's one of the things and what we kind of mentioned earlier was was the whole creationist citing really old literature. Like, I'm like, okay, can we at least keep it in this century?
Oh yeah, or when they're relying on that's why bringing up this Huxley point was so evasive on the part of Sanford and Rupe, because you have to remember the data field, that when they're starting out learning stuff, you don't have any data. You're gradually trying to make sense of stuff. So you can presume that early on people get things wrong. And then there are other matters of where you've got scientific revolutions going on. Anybody in the geology field, for example, it doesn't mean that everything before 1975 is obsolete. But remember, before 1975, they weren't recognizing plate tectonics. So that a geology book is trying to accommodate and explain mountain ranges and volcanic things, that they don't have a piece of the puzzle there. They're not realizing how plate subduction is playing a role. And the same thing with working out the developmental biology of Cambrian organisms. Anything before 1995, put a little bit of a flag next to. Why? Because that was in the mid-1990s when they discovered homeobox genes, and therefore any speculations they're doing, or older works on talking about genes in general before 1953, they didn't know what DNA was. So there's layers of data that the person, they were doing perfectly good science with the information they had at the time, but you can't treat it like the Holy Grail. Old Sewer Tapes points out in here that the same thing on scholarship. Kent Hovind rarely citing anything post 1970. He'll trot out some books. He's got this stuff.
That was why I said exactly sewer takes when I read that. I'm like, yeah, exactly. And then you got old scratch going, and then it's from a first grade textbook. That was still priceless.
I even underlined, and I put up, and I see if I can find an example of where I here's how I annotate my crap. Oh well, yeah. I'll see if anybody can see this closely, but where see, this is why I deface my properties. You'll notice I got right up in the very first footnote up there, I've underlined 1985. And because that says, why are they citing a source from 1985 on this? That's really old, the information, and they're using it just for an authority quote. You're always very suspicious when they're drawing on material like that. Why are they suddenly citing a Stringer paper from 1982, which he did earlier in the book, a couple pages prior, when Stringer is very much active and he's got stuff from the 21st century? Why are you drawing on something that's 30 years old? Oh, I think it's because he doesn't want to, he's dealing with a blip of authority quoting and not doing it for that purpose. So that's always a dead giveaway of the dates of stuff. On my spreadsheet, I'm actually putting in, so far, most of their material isn't really old. At the moment, it's looking like about 60 some odd % of it is stuff since 2000. But I haven't gone all the way through the book. And we'll see how much of it, and how much, since I highlight the authority quote stuff, I'll be curious to see how much of the authority quoting is the older material. And I'll be able to see that from the spreadsheet analysis. So hopefully people will find that a useful technique they can use on their own. Whenever, if you're getting serious going after a particular creationist and you want to do the same thing that I'm doing, it's not rocket science. You go through source by source by source. You can create a bibliography if they don't already have one. If they have one, it's easier. And you want to track down and do a mix to find out what they're using the source for. And you could do an analysis as to what are they using it for authority quotes or secondary citation? Are they offering data blips? And to the extent you can do so, you want to get the original material to see, does it mean what they claim it means? Because I've already discovered just because they've cited a technical paper doesn't mean it says what they claim it does. And the more they do that, that's a dead giveaway. If somebody can misread a source that clearly, can be using something tendentiously. It's possible, too, that Rupe may have gotten some of his stuff secondarily, that he may scavenge material that he's read in other apologetic sources. He's citing a source that he did not directly read, and he's offering somebody else a secondary opinion of it. Someday, way down the road, because human evolution, I've already got a hell of a lot of material in the Planet of the Apes chapter that it'll be a long time down the road before I'll be revising that for the TIP project, because I did the reptile mammal transition first. The next book that I'll be doing after I finish the second Fogg novel will be on the Discovery Institute's Descent from Darwin list. There's no really detailed breakdown of that. So that's an unfilled hole. And then I'm going to tackle the Olympus, speciation and kinds and baraminology. Nobody's really done a good full spread analysis of the congenital confusion of anti-evolutionists on this. This is one of those 100% failure rate things. Just as the reptile mammal transition is 100% failure rate. That's a data field they just don't discuss. Nobody in the anti-evolution side can quite figure out what they mean by speciation or apply it to the big data field. So there is no such thing as anti-evolution systematics. Baraminology doesn't cut it, and the intelligent designers don't even try. So that's a thing that I'll want to document, and that'll be a big little tome. I'll see just how it sorts out.
Yeah.
I had 2,300 sources for slam dunk. Who knows how many I'll be having for the speciation book.
I think I have an idea. You might need a 2-part novel. First part is the information. The second part is all your sources.
Is the bibliography? Yes, the bibliography volume. No, it'd have to be in one. But there's another matter that relates to it, which is the biogeography matter and paleoclimate. So there's a lot of connections going on. But I want to present the latest material on systematics. I'll have to update a lot of my material, so it's just a lot of stuff to work on it. But that'll be a little while along the line, and I'll be past the third fog novel at that point, assuming I'm still alive. We'll see what happens. So anyway, we're about 10 minutes before the show. Are there any questions from the air quotes peanut gallery out in the live chat there? Now's the time to just jump in on that. I'll respond to that point on here. I'll be continuing through all of their discussion in that book. And so if you look through all the various videos that I've done so far, this is the third one. As I proceed, you'll get not a complete breakdown for the video part of it on their analysis, but you'll get an awful lot of primary source material that you can look up, and you can investigate stuff, and you can check it out for your own. And I'm hoping that if anybody can manage to find an error on my part, please let me know. As anybody that's been following these things knows, if there are creationists that will occasionally come in and comment on the video, and I am not shy to reply.
Yeah. Yeah.
They do that at their own risk.
Yeah.
Because I don't delete comments. If you're going to put in there, I'm going to approve you, and I'm going to comment, and it's going to be up there forever.
Yeah.
And everybody gets to read and see what's going on, and everybody's methods tells. I think I do a rigorous job in defending. Old Scratch asks, yes, can you talk a bit about the changing definition of human? Yeah, in some respects, it's a tempest in a teapot, because we have our population of Homo sapiens. We're the only species on the planet now. All of our close competitors are extinct, so we don't have to worry about it. But the demarcation line as to when did we become human and what does that mean is more than figuring out when the chin arrived or the various component parts. And it really boils down, for me at least, the important issue is, when did we develop language? That's just the holy grail of cognitive problems, because once you have language, communicative structure with semantic language in a way that no other species on Earth apparently has anything quite like it, although the cetaceans may have something that's analogous to it, but we can't tell because they're so alien to us that we can't figure out what's going on in their brains. But once you get language, suddenly everything changes. You can now tell stories. You can make up stories. And that's where religions come from. We make up origin myths. Why is the sky blue? Why are there lions? Why is there death? Why, what are those sprinkly things up in the sky? What the hell's going on in there? What is this stuff with fire? Ooh, how do we get to know about that? And we make up stories. We can't avoid it. It's what makes us. I've worked out that I think the defining characteristic of human beings are two things that are not unique to us, but are unique in our combination. We're the tool-making species that tells stories. That's it. Other species do tools, and other species probably tell tales to one another in curious ways. I think whales do it. I would be surprised if whatever the whales are singing to each other in the humpback songs isn't some kind of narrative. But we can't tell what it is, because their whole linguistic structure is so alien to us. There's 100 million years gap between our branching lineages that to trace back to find a common ancestor, I suspect. And so their brain systems are very distinctive. And the way things have constructed sensory and acoustic landscapes, all of that precursor before the language comes on. And we don't know how far back did whales in the 40 million years ago have calls like that. We know the very early whales didn't do acoustic signaling. and you can trace by certain skull features and other elements and asymmetry in the skull, probably when that acoustic signaling is coming in the same way that you can do that for features with bats. They can tell the very earliest bats weren't good echolocators. They didn't know how to do that yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
But our language is really critical. Jump in.
Yeah, I was just gonna make another really bad joke here. Sorry, but it was on whales telling tales. I don't know if they tell tales, but I do know they have big tails.
Yes, indeed. There we go. And flukes. It was just a fluke that they were telling tales. Old Scratch asked, does artwork play a role as well? Oh, yeah, because artwork is symbol. It's now an object that represents something else. It's not the object itself. And that's a higher cognitive concept. The idea that you can make a little stick figure horse, and for you, that's a horse. And you can then try to make the horse look as much like the horse as you want, and you're selecting things. You see in some of the cave art where they're using multiple, when you count up the number of legs, there's more legs than there are on the animal, and they're trying to convey motion. Yeah. That you've got a bunch of things that are in there that are trying to convey the living thing and what they're selecting and what they're not, what colors they put up, how they relate things to suggest perspective. And all of that is part of the symbologization of things. You can symbolize stuff abstractly. That's what, if you are scraping notches on the bone to reflect the lunar phases, that's a symbol. It's not a picture of a moon. It's not a direct symbol that way, but it's something representative of it. And that's an extremely human trait. It doesn't look like too many non-human animals do that. Although bowerbirds, in picking up stuff, they seem to have a predilection for like certain colors and other things, presumably because the mate likes that. And so you have to feel that, aren't they doing something that's kind of like a work of art? That they're and do they take pride in their work? Are they frustrated if they can't find something that fits? What's going on in their little bird brain? And is it comparable to how an artist feels when, why can't I get that damn glint to look the way the sunlight does in the painting? And I suspect that some animals have that aesthetic sense. There seem to be some a playfulness, the extent to which art relates to play. Games. Why do we make games? Why do we create things that just started out as ritual stuff, often human sacrifice or other things, and we turn them into abstractions? So we play things with little things. We make little wooden pieces and move them around on boards and spend all of this time doing this stuff, or throw balls around and we build giant cathedrals to them. And we do all of this stuff, and we treat them often like religions. Well, I think all of that cognitively connects up with a lot of the same dynamic systems. So does artwork play a role, Old Scratch? Hell yeah. Oh, Old Scratch then ask again. We're having fun here. How can we determine which hominins had language? And the answer is no, we can't, kind of, sort of. But there are ways like the forensic clues. And I discussed quite a bit of this in Planet of the Apes, which I will put a link up to there, blah, blah, blah. Not to the original thing, but the Planet of the Apes chapter. I went into a lot of this stuff and a lot of my notions on things. That's at the tip site. Boop, boop, boop. And that is that my suspicion is that language is developing concurrently with tool use. I don't know that every cognitive theorist thinks that, but quite a few do. And particularly in the section about when they recreate tools, and there's been Toth, I think, is one of the scientists that does this, and there's quite a lot of work that's been done since then. But they're recreating ancient tools, from primitive ones that were being done by Homo erectus all the way down to the much more sophisticated stuff with human beings and atlatls and all the different things. And if you start trying to recreate chipping a piece of flint to chip off an axe head, you discover really quickly that it ain't easy. And you have to figure out, you get used to what stones are useful or not. And you get figure that just hitting it at random isn't going to work. You got to kind of have a feel for what the stone is like inside and the grain and others, to think that maybe if you hit there, you're going to chip off what you need because you don't want to waste any of it. And often what's been thrown away is the big block. So these what they were describing as like choppers or pounders are actually the leftover because they've been chipping off material. Well, it's really plausible to me that as you move farther along on this chain, in order to explain to the kid how you do what you do, you have to explain it to them. You can't just show it. That you've got to be able to explain the lore of why a particular thing, why you picked that particular stone, and why that particular spot on the stone is where you're going to hit, and why you hit it this way rather than that. I feel that that had to be going concurrently with language, and that language and tool use is probably it. Can I prove it? No. We do know that Brokaw's area and Wernicke's area are showing up in the endocasts of Homo habilis. That's the brain thing where they can tell which section because the brain bumps in and makes little rubs on the skull, and you can tell what's going on there. And those are brain systems we use for language. They didn't develop exclusively for language, but they are part of the equation. And so the Homo habilis, the tool maker, is the first group that shows explicitly that Wernicke's area and Brokaw's area in a form that we now recognize are showing up with the first tool maker. And is that a coincidence? I don't think so. If we could get in the time machine and figure that out and go back and listen to them, we could think about it more. But I think grammatical language and that structure, building off of the, and it's also the fact that language is building off of the brain systems that primates use for gesture, not vocal calls. And that's the deep substrate of language. So gesture and mime and hitting hammers and doing stuff. I think some of this stuff starts out as mime and then works out into grunts and other things. But boy, wouldn't you like to have the time machine and go back and listen to find out what's going on? Yeah. But in answer to the question, then my suspicion is, and I would be more surprised to learn that grammatical language as we know it is really late. I think it's absolutely preposterous that it hasn't been with us from the get-go, even though we weren't making complex art until way later. And I think it was virtually the case for Homo erectus, and that its early precursors are showing up in Homo habilis, and things that are the substrates of it in terms of miming and gesturing are probably in place in the Australopithecines, but no way to test it.
Yeah, that makes, I mean, I don't know, I haven't read much on it, but I can say that does make sense because, I mean, looking at it from, you know, like what I do with drafting, if I'm trying to draw something, design something, I can show you how to do it a million times, but if you don't know why you're going to do it, you're going to fail. You got
to explain why you're doing it, why that belongs to where that is. And so I think language, there's even technical papers that have described language as a spandrel. I will put that in there. Spandrel. Everybody should know that word. It's a good word. That's from Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin that coined it back in the 70s. It's a feature that ends up being essential, but it doesn't start out that way. It doesn't start out being adaptive. It's kind of an accident that comes along to the side of something else that may or may not itself be adaptive. And so I think language developed as a spandrel and eventually became essential. And once then you have grammatical language, the moment you can give a name to things, the moment you can tell a story about things, the moment you can describe what you remembered, that now you are describing something that is not the personal experience now, but a recollection of something that the other person could never know about if you didn't tell them. Now you explode into a whole new world of indirect reciprocity, morality, and mythology, and gods, and all that stuff. And just boom, all at once. And it's just a matter of who's a good storyteller. And I can imagine the Leonardo da Vinci of his time being superior, the William Shakespeare of their time being the great storyteller around the fire once they figured out how to do all of that. And that goes way back. So we can calibrate some of the things that seem inconceivable not to be part of a language culture in the tradings and usage of things. I can't imagine some of the artwork and things that are being developed, and why some shells are more attractive than others, and why things are attractive in terms of how far things, when people get stuff from faraway places, aren't the tales, if there's language, they're going to be telling about the faraway places and maybe misunderstanding them. And that some of that stuff is popping up in the mythologies of people and the deep tales. Well, anyway, here we are past our hour. I think I've exhausted the main subject matter. I will put on my little wacky screen share again to put my little logo up in the end of the things, and then we'll give a say goodnight part on here. There we go. And there's the Troubles in Paradise logo again. Has that vaguely steampunk vibe. It'll be part of a continuing series. Keep us going. Tell everybody you know about the project. And I'm going to be keeping at this as long as I can. I hope everybody that's watching the show enjoys the work and feels that what I'm doing is worthwhile.